Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving headfirst into S.Y. Agnon's genuinely chilling 1943 tale, The Lady and the Peddler. Now, on the surface, this story from the Nobel laureate reads like your classic, terrifying Gothic horror. But as we're going to see, it actually disguises a really profound psychological and cultural mystery. We're going to break down the narrative, look at the traditional ways people have understood it over the years, and then explore a fascinating new interpretation that completely flips the script on who the real monster actually is. Let's get right into it.
But before we get completely bogged down in the heavy academic analysis and all those hidden layers of meaning, we have to ask ourselves, what truly lies beneath this terrifying story of a wandering peddler and a carnivorous widow? I mean, why do we even tell stories about monstrous women in the first place? And what are those monsters actually representing? To answer that, we first need to make sure we've got the facts straight on exactly what happens in Agnon's dark little fable.
So, to summarize the plot, picture this. We follow Joseph, a Jewish peddler wandering through this remote, heavily wooded region. He gets caught in a terrible rainstorm and takes refuge with Helen, who is a wealthy Christian lady living all by herself in a house decorated with hunting antlers. And Joseph slowly traps himself in a twisted domestic nightmare. First, he fixes her roof so she'll let him stay. Then he sheds his peddler clothes, and eventually he literally moves into her murdered husband's bed. He becomes entirely dependent on her, and their living situation starts to mimic a marriage. But there is a major problem.
Joseph starts getting incredibly suspicious because, well, Helene prepares all these lavish meals for him, but she never actually eats with him. In fact, she refuses to touch normal human food altogether. So when Joseph starts pressing her with questions about her past and, frankly, her weird dietary habits, his questions are met with this incredibly ominous warning. She tells him, "He who delves too deeply digs his own grave." I mean, talk about a massive red flag.
Eventually, Joseph pushes her to talk about her previous husbands. She coldly counts them out on her fingers, 5 in total. And when he asks where they are, Helene points to her belly and says, "Some of them, perhaps, are here." Yeah, she flat out confesses to drinking men's blood and eating human flesh. The woman he has grown completely dependent on is a literal vampire, a cannibal who has basically been fattening him up for the slaughter.
And the way this whole thing wraps up, absolutely wild. One night, a really disturbing dream triggers Joseph's Jewish identity, so he rises at dawn and steps out into the snow to pray. By doing this, he unknowingly saves his own life. Helene approaches his bed with a hunting knife, stabs the empty mattress in a total frenzy, and ends up critically wounding herself. And because she can only survive on human flesh, which she obviously can't get anymore, she literally starves to death. The ground is frozen solid, so Joseph can't even dig a grave. He places her coffin on the roof, where she's ultimately consumed by scavenging birds. It is just a wildly macabre ending.
Okay, so moving right along to the traditional explanation of the story, the national allegory. Because Agnon published this in 1943, right in the thick of World War II, scholars have long viewed this text as way more than just a spooky folktale.
For decades, critics mapped the story out basically like this. Joseph is seen as the ultimate symbol of the wandering Jew in the diaspora. He's passive, he's eager to please, and he's completely dependent on the hospitality of strangers. Helene, on the other hand, represents the hostile Gentile world, specifically Europe. Her initial generosity masks this predatory vampiric appetite that threatens to consume the Jew entirely. Looking through this lens, the story is a grim reflection of the very real existential threat facing European Jewry during the Holocaust.
Now, alongside that national allegory, traditional interpreters also read this as a strict moralistic warning rooted in Jewish law, or halakha. The conventional wisdom here is pretty straightforward. Joseph's near-death experience is the direct result of cultural assimilation. By shedding his peddler's clothes, eating unkosher food, and entering into an illicit relationship with a foreign woman, he erodes his own communal boundaries. So the traditional takeaway is that yielding to foreign temptations leads directly to spiritual and physical death.
But what if we look at it from a totally different angle? Recently, a brand new perspective was published by Dr. Danielle Grevich. She argues that the traditional reading is actually a bit one-sided. It casts the male subject as the innocent victim and the female character as just this allegorical tool. So she peels back that allegory to examine the very real gender dynamics at play, uncovering an entirely different kind of cultural anxiety.
To really grasp this new reading, Grevich introduces us to a concept called the monstrous feminine. This is an archetype deeply embedded in patriarchal culture. Historically, literature tends to split women into two rigid camps. You've got the angelic, obedient housewife, and then the dark, demonic femme fatale.
The monstrous feminine demonizes women who act outside of strict domestic control. It essentially tells us that a woman with independence, autonomy, and erotic agency is inherently dangerous and therefore must be destroyed. This idea ties directly into a theory called objection. Basically, objection is about taking something that unsettles your identity or disrupts your system and expelling it to protect your worldview. In this feminist reading, Aline is a powerful, independent woman living entirely on her own terms out in the woods. Because she flat out refuses to submit to traditional patriarchal norms, she disrupts the system. So what happens? She gets cast out as a literal monster, a cannibalistic vampire, simply to preserve male authority and social stability. She has to be made into an object of horror so she can be safely rejected. By comparing Helene to ancient figures like the sirens of Greek myth or Lilith, the mythical first wife of Adam who refused subservience, Gurevich draws a really powerful parallel. Just like Lilith, whose erotic power was feared as a literal force of destruction, Helene defies domesticity and consumes her husbands. Gurevich argues that Helene doesn't just represent anti-Jewish hostility, she actually represents deep-seated male anxiety about secularization, modernity, and female equality.
And here is a massive detail that traditional scholars almost always breeze right past. Joseph actually initiated the encounter. He wasn't just this passive, helpless prey. He knocked on her door. And when she told him to go away, he pushed his way in. He fixed her roof specifically so he could stay. He flattered her and actively initiated the romance. The narrative completely frames him as a victim, but in reality, he was the instigator who projected his own desires and his subsequent guilt right onto her.
Now, this brings us to a historical twist that honestly kind of blew my mind. What if this vampiric woman wasn't just a metaphor for the Gentile world? What if she wasn't just a generic mythic archetype? What if she was actually inspired by a very real person in the author's life?
Enter Dr. Elizabeth Kreiselmeyer. Archival research suggests that Helene is highly likely a literary transfiguration of this woman, who was an actual acquaintance of S.Y. Agnon. She was basically everything the patriarchal order feared. She was an autonomous, highly educated, modern professional. She boldly divorced her German husband, married a Turkish physician, moved to Istanbul, and even adopted the exotic name Zuleika. She was a fiercely liberated woman living entirely by her own rules.
So the theory goes that Agnon didn't just invent this monster out of thin air. He may have fused his own personal desires, his fears, and his resentments toward this real, liberated woman into the monstrous character of Helene. The story acts as a symbolic condensation of his own emotional ambivalence. He's literally projecting his anxiety about modern, independent women onto this dark, folkloric canvas.
When you look at it this way, the entire meaning of The Lady and the Peddler completely shifts. It becomes a harsh parable of judgment. It's a verdict on modernity and women's autonomy. Because Helene, and by extension, the real-life Elizabeth, embodies choices that were profoundly unacceptable to the author's traditional worldview, she is judged with ultimate severity. The author uses his narrative power to literally execute the independent woman, reducing her to a starving beast getting pecked apart by vultures.
So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this to ponder. Was the peddler truly ensnared by a demonic beast, or did patriarchal anxiety invent a monster to mask its own vulnerabilities? Is the true horror in the story the vampire herself, or is it the terrifying lengths to which a culture will go to demonize a woman who simply refuses to be controlled? Thank you so much for exploring this fascinating text with us, and remember to always keep questioning what lies beneath the stories we tell.